Welcome to Data and Biotech, a podcast from Cordine where we explore how companies leverage data to drive innovation in life sciences. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with an expert from the world of biotechnology to understand how they're using data science to solve technical challenges, streamline operations, and further innovation in their business. This week, we're joined by Lana Denysyk, Head of Real-World Data Assets at Novo Nordisk. During the interview, Lana shares how real-world data is used in biotech, diving into how it can help clinicians understand patient experiences outside of clinical trials. Lana also discusses the challenges in acquiring and utilizing real-world data, the importance of having a centralized team to manage it, and emerging data types like patient-reported outcomes and health equity data. Here we go.
Lana Denysyk, welcome to the Data and Biotech podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So just to kick us off, would you mind giving us sort of a brief introduction to your background?
Absolutely. And then just before I start, I want to say that, I am an employee of Novo Nordisk, but I'm only discussing my personal opinions and reflections in this podcast. And with that said, so my career to date, I earned my master's degree in public health at Columbia University. And after that, I started working in quality improvement at a hospital in New York. And that was where my interest in real world data really grew, because I saw how impactful it could be when you're looking at patient outcomes in the real world. You're seeing how the application of care to patients, tracking it, understanding it, can really improve outcomes quite directly. From there, I moved to a small life sciences consulting firm where I learned a lot more about pharmaceutical companies and how they use real world data. And from there, I went to IQVIA, which is quite well known in the space of real world data. I worked on the real world solutions team, working with pharma companies on their strategy of how they use real world data, what sources they might use, how to best approach that. From there, I worked at BMS as an associate director of real world strategy. And from there, I moved to Nova Nordisk, and I was the first one in the role of real world data steward. I built up the role, and I now head up a department called Real World Data Assets at Novo.
Awesome. What does your role entail?
Again, this department is Real World Data Assets. We manage secondary use real world data licenses, and basically ensuring that our research teams have accessible and usable real world data. And that's at a very high level. And I also have a strategic focus at the corporate level to understand how we can better leverage real world data and real world evidence across the organization.
Interesting. As you reflect on your time doing quality improvement at a hospital at the beginning of your career, do you think differently about those days, based on all of the knowledge that you've acquired from being in the real world data ecosystem over the last several years?
Absolutely. And I also still reflect on, that hospital was still using paper charts that were scanned in. So analyzing that data was actually incredibly difficult. So also understanding how the tech really helps to analyze data, how input of data from a physician standpoint, from a hospital standpoint, having the structure to input this data is so important, because you can have all the data in the world. This is a problem we have with big data in general, right? If you can't query it easily, if you can't clean it easily, if you can't really pull out what you need easily, then it's useless.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you spent this early part of your career beating your head up against the challenges of having all of the data you needed to answer these critical questions in a hospital environment. And now you spent this next part of your career liberating the data and making it available to all of these people who need to answer the critical questions they need to, advance the life sciences. So since you're living in it day to day, can you just give us an orientation to what we mean when we talk about real world data? What's its function, and how do biotech organizations use it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's so many different ways to define real world data, but the definition that I use is basically all data around a patient's health or healthcare that doesn't come from a clinical trial. So it can be so broad. It can be your claims data when you have your insurance pay for your care. It can be your electronic medical record data. We call it EMR data. And that's when you go to your doctor and they put in notes in the chart. That's your EMR data. It can be your Apple Watch or your Fitbit. It can be your lab tests, your MRI scans, any genomic data. If you do, for example, 23andMe, the function of real world data is to show what's actually happening with the patient while they're living their lives. In a clinical trial, we have incredibly controlled circumstances under which patients receive care, take medication, have tests conducted. And it has to be that way so that we can understand if the treatment has efficacy. But patients aren't always living under ideal circumstances. Life is pretty messy. So real world data helps us understand, okay, with with patients who have more comorbid conditions than are reflected in a clinical trial, are they still having the same outcomes? Are patients having trouble adhering to their medications? On a clinical trial, it's much easier to track the adherence, but in the real world, it's actually one of our hardest issues to tackle because you can see if a patient picked up a drug and you can't know if they actually took it. You can make assumptions, but you just never know. And then also to see what their outcomes are in the real world, like I mentioned. So if we can see, we assume they're taking their medications, they're having their tests done, they're seeing their doctors, is that showing improved outcomes when things are under less ideal circumstances?
Interesting. Yeah. So it seems like a lot of the processes that biotech companies undergo in, bringing therapeutic solutions to market is in very controlled environments where you're trying to make sure that all of the other variables and factors that might influence the outcome that you're measuring are controlled for, that it, can't possibly account for the outcomes in question. But then obviously when you bring them to market, patients are interacting with them every day in circumstances that are much more complex. And so it sounds like the real world data is that window into what happens when these controlled circumstances that we've designed in the lab to measure the outcome we care about meet the circumstances in which people live their everyday lives.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really well put.
Interesting. In that context, since you have exposure to all of the data assets that a biotech organization gathers in the course of all of the activities that they undergo, from R&D through clinical trials and commercialization, can you just help us understand where real world data fits into that broader data ecosystem and how it gets integrated in?
Yeah, absolutely. And real world data is just one component of a broad ecosystem of data. And I don't have visibility into every type of data, but we have clinical trial data, we have historic clinical trial data, we have real world data that's used for development. We have other types of real world data used for commercial purposes. We have early research data, things like mouse models or things like that. There's so many types of data that we can work with. And real world data isn't always appropriate for all of your evidence needs. I think it's incredibly valuable to have an overview of your entire data ecosystem in an organization and be able to say, here are our evidence needs. Here's what we need to answer. What type of data is best suited to that? Because every type of data will not be best suited to every type of research question. So you need to be able to distinguish where something should fit. And having that overview helps you, because otherwise without it, it can become siloed and you might not be leveraging the best data for your evidence in a most effective way.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the way that you know how real world data fits into that broader data ecosystem is based on the questions that the organization is asking and the situations in which the real world data can be brought to bear as sort of the best data asset to assist with answering that question.
Exactly. And yeah, in general, the data should never drive the research question. The research question should always drive what data helps you answer that.
Interesting. So can you give me some examples of sort of the types of stakeholder groups that have research questions where real world data, is brought to bear?
Some stakeholders that use real world data could be members of the development team who are helping bring a drug to market. The use of real world data is inching up in the timeline of drug development. It can start from maybe helping plan a clinical trial to understand where are the patients so that we can recruit them. And real world data can help you find, what hospital systems they are in, and you can contact that hospital system and know that you can recruit there. It can come to clinical trial planning as well. There are some tools that exist where you can funnel out, or you have a funnel where you show, if I use these inclusion-exclusion criteria, I will filter out way too many patients, and then I won't be able to recruit for this clinical trial. Let me see if I can edit these inclusion-exclusion criteria and then have more success in recruiting and finding our patient population for the clinical trial. There are other departments where they need to fulfill regulatory requirements, for example, from these regulatory bodies who say you have to show us a safety study. And they would be using real world data to show the safety of the drug once it's on the market. And we also have some commercial colleagues who, use it for discussions with payers or regulators as well.
Interesting. So the place where I don't see real world data being primarily used is sort of on the R&D side. Like, does this particular therapeutic approach or, drug work? that's prior to sort of the real world data conversations. But once we have sort of an understanding of the biology underlying a therapy and, beginning to think about bringing the drug into a clinical trial environment, that's where the real world data starts to become valuable.
I think that's where it's historically been, but all of pharma is moving to using real world data to see if the drug is working. So a lot of pharma companies are doing things like innovative trial design, where you leverage real world data as part of your clinical trial. So that could be something like having a historical control arm, where rather than recruiting patients as a control arm, you can develop one in retrospective data and not need to recruit those patients. You can also leverage real world data as part of the active arm of the trial and have patients input information or have their doctors input their information and pull from their EMR. And that saves patients a lot of time and burden on driving to the site and having these additional tests conducted if they're also receiving it as their point of care.
Yeah, so from the patient perspective, that's like integrating the clinical trial into the existing care processes they're already undergoing, rather than asking them to do an additional thing, but still providing the real world data that the pharmaceutical company needs back in order to answer the questions that are critical to the success of the trial.
Exactly. And it always depends on the clinical trial of how you can do that and still abiding by, the clinical trial regulations and processes. But we see that being integrated more and more across, all pharma companies.
You've got all of these stakeholder groups across the organization that sort of want real world data to inform their processes. But I'm assuming that there are some sort of resource limitations or some sort of prioritization exercise that needs to be undergone in order to decide who gets what real world data and in what quantity and from what vendors. So can you just walk us through kind of, how you think about a process like that, and how you think about evaluating or scoping a request for real world data?
Absolutely. And I'll answer that question by answering another question first. So in general, I think, of course, there are so many stakeholders across all life sciences companies who want to use real world data to answer all their questions. And the first issue I think that we come across is, what are the limitations of real world data? What can't you do with the data? Because there can be a lot of expectations of, this will be easy, just buy this data, answer this question, and we're done. But it's really not a straightforward process to even answer a simple question. So to give an example, let's say we just want to know how many diabetes patients are in a given geographical area. How are you defining these patients? They don't all have an ICD code of a diagnosis. And if we know they don't have an ICD code, how do we pick up the rest of that population, right? You might be missing the majority of the population in a certain claims data set or EMR data set. And then you go in knowing they don't all have this code. So what else can we do? How else can we find them? Let's start looking at their lab values, right? That could be a way to find a patient. Are their lab values at a level that show that they likely have diabetes? But how many patients have labs measured regularly? How many have access to healthcare on a regular basis and have that input into their chart that we have access to, that we can see? There's claims data sources that we can see a lab test was billed for, but we can't see the value of it. So we say, okay, we know they had that done, but was it elevated or was it normal? And then from there, when you go to geography, location is typically masked for patient privacy, because we can't have, if we have that deep clinical data from a patient, we can't have other identifying information like their geography, where they're located, any other information about them, because it might make it identifiable. So there's so many pitfalls where, just to start with, like a simple question, right? How many diabetes patients are here? It's really not easy. So I think that's the biggest issue across stakeholders in general. Once it's been determined that real world data is a relevant data source for research questions, there's really a balance between, should an organization prioritize data sets that are broad and have many therapy areas and have the ability to answer many research questions for many teams, or should they focus on a very specific data set that has exactly what they need but can't be used for any other purpose? And I think for an organization, you always need a balance. There are always research questions that do require a really specific data set that captures variables that are critical to the research. But then there also should be a balance of, here's a broad data set that has a lot of information about patient care and patient outcomes, but it might not have these really hard to find variables that some studies may need. And from there, you can link or modify or add to the data in certain circumstances.
Yeah, this is so interesting because what it highlights for me is that the way that I framed the request as being sort of, a reactive request that's coming from the stakeholder, the way your positioning is that, organizations need to have formative input from real world data experts like yourself into the strategy of acquiring the data, which requires someone like you to have visibility into the entire scope of research questions that you want to be asking of real world data so that you can deploy the resources that you have in the most effective possible way to answer, the maximum number of research questions with the best data available.
Exactly. And yeah, I do think it requires having a central team focused on real world data so that the people who are focused on research, focused on delivering evidence, they can focus on that. But to have a team who is only focused on real world data, how to acquire it, how to manage it, I think is very useful for an organization so that they're not operating in silos or having people who are data scientists and researchers figuring out how to work with contracting and legal to get this license through. That shouldn't sit with them. It both requires having a central team managing real world data and also an organizational approach of how do we assess evidence? How do we determine what evidence we as an organization need? Because without that, then you are operating in silos. And then you might be duplicating data licenses, which is, you're spending money unnecessarily, or you're spending even more resources unnecessarily and conducting the same study in different geographies. So the headquarters might do one thing, an affiliate might do the same exact thing, spending the same amount of money, maybe defining their patients differently because they're not coordinating together. And so there's really a huge risk to organizations if they don't have this central view of evidence and data.
Right. So the role that groups of people who own real world data play is sort of connecting the dots between these different stakeholder groups and facilitating the process of acquiring the right data that meets everyone's needs, while also acknowledging the resource constraints and sort of prioritizing as a collective which research questions should take priority from a data acquisition and data strategy perspective. Is that right?
Of course. And I think resource constraints are a common issue among pharma companies, especially when it comes to analyzing the data. I think ways around that or ways to actually manage it are to have more platforms and tools that can allow for those who are not data scientists to query the data more easily and answer some of these faster questions so that it's not requiring a data scientist to get in and really define this research question if it could be something simple that you just need to know to help answer a question you have in a meeting. It's not something that will be published scientifically.
Yeah, interesting. So, what I'm hearing you say is that, it's better to have standardized processes for managing the data and getting it to analysis readiness as part of this, centralized governance over real world data.
Absolutely. Because as the industry evolves, as the world evolves, we have so many new types of data. So having the standard process allows for the flexibility that when there is a new data type that an organization might have never worked with before, at least they know how to bring it in and how to bring it in and make it available to researchers. Even though it's a different type of data, it's still the same process.
Yeah. What does a standardized process like that look like? Like, what are some of the considerations that you should take into account when putting in place a standardized process like that?
Yeah. So I think a lot of organizations can benefit from having plans in place of working with procurement and legal, data protection office, your IT teams to contract for the data and then to land it. It's what environment is it in within your organization? Is it something that researchers have access to? Do they have their preferred tools and languages that they can then actually analyze the data?
Right. So is that like sort of, should I think about that as a centralized data stack, like a data warehouse or a data lake? And then
I think you could think about it as a data lake. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of this centralized repository where all of the researchers that need access, have the access that they need to the right data, but, there's access control around who can access what data based on, their permissions and their, very real need for gaining access to particular sets of data. So, you mentioned regulatory issues and like how you navigate that. How does that play into gathering these big real world data sets together in a place where researchers can access them.
Yeah, and that's a huge challenge for global companies, which most major pharma companies are. There are so many regulations that they need to abide by. So within every geography that a company may be working in, they need to ensure they're abiding by local regulations as well as the patient privacy regulations in the geography where the patient data is. Companies need to be aware of HIPAA and GDPR and local regulations because some local regulations may go even further. So it can have a really large impact at the point of contracting and receiving the data. And this all needs to be resolved prior to that.
So we've got these different privacy regulations that you have to abide by based on where the patients are coming from and where the companies are located. But, what I'm hearing you say is that you kind of have to take a maximalist approach to the regulatory requirements that the entire organization faces and basically make sure that all of the real world data that you're acquiring abides by all of the regulatory regimes that you're subject to. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. We never want to put patient privacy at risk, and that is of utmost importance. There might be better solutions in the future, but for now, that maximalist approach is, I think, a good approach for pharma companies to take to ensure that patient privacy is never put at risk.
So, I'm imagining that by getting exposed to all of these different research questions and all of the data sets that are out there, that you have sort of this unique lens into real world data strategy, looking, 3 years, 5 years into the future at where an organization should be from the perspective of real world data. Can you just give us some insight into how you think about constructing a real world data strategy over that kind of time horizon?
So strategically, I think pharma companies should be looking at a few different things. And one is, do you have the right data? Are you able to answer the research questions that you currently have with the real world data you currently have? And if not, conduct that gap analysis and see what's missing, and then have a plan to find that data that you need. I think second, do you have the right resources within the company? Are your employees trained to be able to analyze this data and work with this data in the most effective way? Are they learning from each other? Lastly, I think, are people who aren't data scientists or who aren't directly in the research at the company, are they aware of how to use real world data and the best way to leverage that to the limitations I mentioned before? I think it's really important for many people across the pharma company to be at least knowledgeable in what can real world data do, what can't it do, and how could it be applied. And so all of those things I think are necessary for a strategic lens to look at how pharma companies can better leverage real world data in a more effective way in the future.
So based on all the vendors that you've, interacted with over time, what advice or guidance would you give to real world data vendors to, position their data assets to be most valuable to, biotech and pharma companies?
Robust and representative real world data is really important. And I see it as a powerful tool to focus on health equity. And what is growing, but still kind of in a nascent stage, is representative data that reflect patient populations. It should account for how health equity is accounted for in their data, how they measure it, and how they utilize the findings to improve patient outcomes. For example, is there a way to link those patient outcomes to any social determinants of health or other health equity data variables?
Are there sort of key questions that you ask about the data assets that are being presented to you that you feel like vendors might tend to not be as prepared for as they could be?
Well, I'll phrase this in a different way. So I think that in general, of course, the research drives what our data needs are. So when a pharma company is speaking to a vendor, I think they really need to account for what specific variables are needed for this certain research question. An example could be a vendor says that they have this variable available for almost all their patients. And that sounds very nice. But that pharma company might need at least 3 measurements of that variable over time to be able to track how that patient is doing over time. And then that number can drop significantly. So my advice to pharma companies is really get into the granular details of how are you going to do this research? Which specific variables that are typically hard to find do you need? And go after those, because that will impact how you can do your research. And you really need to get granular and talk about specific variables and how many measurements per patients you need to make sure that that data is relevant for you.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So that from the vendor perspective, it's sort of understanding the research questions that the biotech and pharma companies are asking so that they can position their data sets relative to the research questions, since that's the source of all need coming to the vendor. And then from the biotech and pharma company perspective, what I'm hearing is that they need to define their requirements much more specifically for the data than they would otherwise approach it. So it's not enough to just have a research question and say, generally, this type of data is useful to answer this type of research question. Ideally, we would have these specific data points about every patient in the data set over time, for example, in order to sufficiently answer the research questions for the requirements of the organization. Am I hearing you correctly?
Exactly. Yeah, I think if a pharma company approaches this as just saying, here's a broad research question, I think this data source might work. I think that's a really easy way to spend a lot of money on something that's not useful for you. You really need to be specific about how you will conduct this research to get the most value out of the data that you license.
It sounds like part of the role of this centralized real world data organization is sort of teaching the organization to ask the right questions about the data that they want to acquire, and making sure that, research questions are well formulated and sort of meeting these minimum standards for what information is needed to know what data needs to be acquired.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's part of this objective approach to assessing the quality of a data source specific to a research question, right? There's of course a way to assess quality of data in general, but I don't think that goes far enough. You can, of course, assess, is this data good? Yes, it may be. But then you do have to take it that next level and say, is this relevant to the research I'm currently conducting? And both need to be true for this to be a relevant data source.
Yeah. So in this way, quality is very context specific. That yes. a data set that is of a high enough quality in one context might not meet the quality standards of another context.
Exactly.
Very interesting. So, as you look toward the future of real world data, are there any emerging data sets that are becoming available that you're excited to, get your hands on or get broader access to or disseminate more, or any new types of questions that you think people are going to be able to ask inside of biotech and pharma companies that they weren't able to ask before?
Yeah, and I think in general terms, pharma has typically been working with claims and EMR data sources for quite some time now. Of course, there's still room for growth across many pharma companies to utilize them, but they're fairly well established in use. I think going beyond those to patient-reported outcomes. So that could be things like your Fitbit, your Apple Watch, an app that you track your health or mood, something like that. Understanding the patient's perspective and their view on their health. As I mentioned, the social determinants of health data, there's so much that impacts our health that has nothing to do with us. The environment we're in can really impact our health, and understanding how it does impact our health and also how we can then resolve that is really important. I'm excited to see more of that type of data and other data, like leveraging more imaging data or omics data, things like that. Those are newer types of data that are becoming available and being leveraged more by pharma companies.
Interesting. For anyone out there who's, in the process of building up real world data capability at a biotech or pharma organization, are there any challenges that you would advise them to watch out for in the process of building up these muscles internally to sort of gather these data sets together, standardize processes, get the capabilities out to the rest of the organizations to be able to analyze it?
I would say there's nothing but challenges in putting this together. Of course, it's necessary and required, I think, for pharma companies to operate in this day and age, but there are so many challenges and pitfalls. My advice would be get the right lawyers to help you. Have the right teams around you in terms of your legal team, your procurement team, your IT team, and your researchers, and really build those relationships so that those around the organization can trust that you are working to get them the data that they need, so that they are willing to work with you and have it kind of go through the central team.
Right. Because I can imagine a circumstance where if there's any mistrust in the system there, then it's very possible for sort of like the end around to happen where data gets acquired that shouldn't be acquired, or it's not stored in the way it's supposed to be stored, or there's complaints about the additional layers of process that need to be gone through in order to get the data So people want to move fast, but in actuality, as an organization, you need to move slightly slower in order to get to a better outcome.
And I think in general, without the trust, pharma companies really risk remaining in their silos. That trust is necessary to break those silos down and have it be a much more open, collaborative environment.
Yeah, very interesting. So for anyone who's coming up to speed in the real world data arena or staying up to speed in the real world data arena, are there any resources you would point people to, blogs or Substacks that you're reading or books that you've read, podcasts that you're listening to that you think would be helpful to them in, keeping their finger on the pulse of this area?
So I think attending conferences where real world data and real world evidence are highlighted, understanding what research is currently being conducted, talking to the vendors, in particular at these types of conferences, to see what types of new data are being made available for licensing. There's so much to learn from just being able to speak to the vendors themselves, others who are conducting real world data. I think just ensuring that you're up on the research, especially in therapy areas of focus for your company, seeing what types of data sources they're using. If you see someone publish an article or publish some research that they've conducted and it's around real world data, look to see, okay, what was the data source that was listed here? And if that's something that's interesting to you, then reach out to that vendor and start talking to them about what can you do for your research questions? What can they make available for you?
Yes, there's this way in which the researchers who have specific research questions and have had to acquire their own data are sort of forced to go through that process of determining what the best data source is that's available to answer that question. And so that can sort of be a signal to you out in the market of, the best data sources available for a given research question type, or, what are the market trends in terms of the types of data people are acquiring to answer certain types of research questions. Lana, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to hear more about your world and to learn about the world of real world data. So yeah, look forward to connecting down the line.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode of Data in Biotech. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review in your podcast platform of choice. See you next time.